across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It has been quite a weekend, and as you probably can imagine, we'll spend a little bit of our time today talking about these two mass shootings in 2 days, and then add to it some of the other facts and figures as well. Jim Dennison put it this way: horror, anger, grief, anguish, heartbreak, mourning, shock. These are some of the emotions that many of us have felt over the weekend, but he said surprise is not one of them. And that's one of the biggest tragedies of these tragedies. We've come to almost expect them. I'm going to spend some time today, of course, trying to sort a little bit of this out this hour, but I'm not going to spend all of our time on it. There are other topics that are relevant and important as well. The next hour, Doug Groothuis has been scheduled for some time to be with us as we talk about the significance of Francis Schaeffer. I've always wanted to kind of cover that. I've said this is a generation that knows not Schaeffer, and yet we owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to him. And since we have him scheduled, I wanted to keep that, if nothing else, to break up the conversation so that we aren't spending all of our time talking about mass shootings that have taken place. Because if you think about it, it's really two individuals through some rash acts, through their own mental instability, which we'll get into, due to their own circumstances that have changed almost everything in this country over the last probably 72 hours. So we will spend some time talking with Doug Groothuis about some things other than the shooting. Then we do have Alex Kendrick with us because the new film Overcomer is out, and I wanted you to know about that. And then we will get into all of the facts and figures in that third hour on the national show. But since this is the local opportunity to look at some of those issues, let's, if we can, kind of address some of those topics. And the first thing that I want to put on the table is the numbers and why it's probably important for us to be a little bit skeptical about some of the facts and figures, the phrases, the use of this politically and everything else that obviously is going to go on, because we are in the midst of a campaign season. And even if we are not, we know that there are going to be lots of people that are going to rush to the microphones, rush to the Facebook and Twitter feeds to make all sorts of statements, and many times very outlandish statements. But even people trying to, if you will, responsibly report this still are subject to the kinds of statistics and facts and figures that you run into. And a good example of that is, I just quoted from Jim Dennison. I won't quote a lot from him today, although I'm looking forward to the next time he'll be with us. I had erroneously last week said he'd be on this week. He'll actually be on next week, but still looking forward to that. Said that there have been 251 mass shootings in America this year. And you have yourself saying, wait a minute, I only see a few of those, and how do we come up with those numbers? Then, of course, Nick Pitts will be with us tomorrow, and he talks about the fact that there have been 1,300 people injured or killed in mass shootings. And again, you go, wait, that doesn't seem right, because even Time magazine says 61 people have been killed in mass shootings in 2019, which is horrific enough, because let's just face it, we've talked about 30 people that are dead just over the weekend, but half of the number runs from January to now. So this is the first, if I will, disclaimer that when you start reading things in a news report, you read it in a Facebook or Twitter post, you may want to reevaluate this, because as they look at these numbers here in Time magazine, they come up with numbers that are substantially less than some of the other ones that are quoted. Well, the reason is Nick Pitts in this particular case was quoting from Gun Violence Archive. Okay, they're probably going to have a little more of a bias in that regard. And so they're going to count any kind of shooting that could be in any stretch of the imagination called a mass shooting, one that involves more than one or two people. And so they come up with a different set of numbers. And my favorite line on that is 274 people have been killed in Chicago, said no one in the mainstream press. There have been 274 people just in Chicago alone killed this year. But again, that rarely gets covered because, well, that's just Chicago and we won't count that. But, of course, if you are looking for arguments trying to make your case that we have gun violence, and that's a classic illustration of gun violence, that's 274 deaths. That's as of yesterday, might even be higher today. 1,355 wounded, shot and wounded, and all sorts of different homicides that have taken place as a result of that. And that's just in the city of Chicago. Should those be counted? Well, if you do, then you can get the numbers really high. If you only focus on something that happens at a Walmart or a nightclub or at a garlic festival, well, then you come up with different numbers. So, first of all, I want to obviously make the statement that I think you already understand, and that is any death is a tragic death, whether it happened in Chicago, whether it happened in Gilroy, California, whether it happened in El Paso, Texas, whether it happens in Dayton, Ohio. But some of these numbers get thrown around so much, and some of these comments are made with such regularity that after a while, I think you as a listener, as a viewer, as a reader, as a consumer of news have to sometimes just say, what in the world? Who do I trust and where do these numbers come from? And I think it's a really good question to ask. One of the articles we've posted here is a good kind of summary. 30 people died and dozens were wounded in 2 mass shootings within 13 hours of each other in the United States, of course, shocking the country, and, of course, creating another conversation about gun control, the words that are used by the president or other individuals, and we'll get into that in just a minute. This goes on to say the first massacre occurred on Saturday morning in a heavily Hispanic border town of El Paso, where a gunman killed 20 people at a Walmart store before surrendering to police. Texas Governor Greg Abbott said the rampage appeared to be a hate crime, and we, of course, now have his manifesto, which I'll cite a little bit later. 21-year-old individual from a town very close to where we're broadcasting from right now. Across the country, a gunman opened fire in a downtown district of Dayton, Ohio, early Sunday morning, killing 9 people, wounding at least 26 others. And the assailant in that case was shot dead by police. The El Paso shooting reverberated on the campaign trail, as you might imagine. We've had a number of candidates, Mayor Pete, Beto O'Rourke, and others that have drawn connections to President Donald Trump, and we'll probably get into that as well. And something that I did not see coming, but I guess we should have expected that, Mexico is going to file legal action against the United States as a result of the shooting in El Paso. The Mexican foreign minister on Sunday vowed to take legal action against the United States after at least 3, and now that number's higher, Mexican nationals were killed during the shooting. Of those 26 that were injured, at least 9 were Mexican nationals. And so they're going to take legal action, arguing that we haven't done enough to protect Mexican citizens. That's kind of a tit for tat or a response to some of the other actions by the president. So just a couple of issues on the table. When we come back, I want to get into some more aspects of the shooting. Why did 2 happen in rapid fire? Some people are saying some of these shootings have contagion. We'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Over the last few years, I've talked about how many times both sides of the political debate make wrong assumptions about each other. This misperception is certain to increase as we enter into this political season. Arthur Brooks provides further academic documentation for this reality. A study that appeared in the Journal of Politics revealed that the average Democrat believes that more than 40% of Republicans earn more than $250,000. That is a number that is completely wrong. Approximately 2% of Republicans are doing that well financially. The study also found that Republicans believe that a significant percent of Democrats are LGBTQ. Only 6% fit that designation. This misperception apparently is worse for liberals than for conservatives. Jonathan Haidt, in his book, The Righteous Mind, documented a detailed study of predictions liberals and conservatives would make about each other. He concluded that moderates and conservatives were more accurate in their predictions, whether they were pretending to be liberals or conservatives. Liberals were the least accurate, especially those described themselves as very liberal. That last point also shows up in the research cited by Arthur Brooks. The perception gap for the average Democrat or Republican is significant and concerning, but it pales in comparison to the most partisan in both parties. It reports that progressive activists and devoted conservatives are the most inaccurate in their perceptions of the other side. And they are driving much of the debate. Only 22% of U.S. adults are on Twitter, and 80% of the tweets come from 10% of the users. So he concludes that if we rely on Twitter for your political information, you're being informed by 2.2% of the population. This is one more reason for you to exercise great discernment in this election season. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you would like to join our conversation, I'd love to hear from you, 1-800-351-1212. You know, when these various shootings have taken place, we always hear kind of the routine reactions about words as violence, about guns and common sense gun laws, and on and on and on. What I'm going to try to do today is try to bring a couple of new things to the conversation. But you know as well as I do that some people have used this particular set of circumstances that unfolded over the weekend as an opportunity to make all sorts of statements. 2 shootings within 13 hours. I want to talk about in just a minute this idea of contagion that some people are starting to talk about. The idea that in some respects mass shootings are a slow motion riot, and a couple of things that maybe you have not heard people talk about. But the sad reality is that even as we're trying to determine whether or not this is a hate crime, you think probably is, the hate that is surfacing, and even just the amount of mean-spirited names that were given to everything from the president to the lieutenant governor in the state of Texas and on and on and on. I mean, do they not understand that they're decrying hate, and then they say so mean and hateful things and not understand the circumstances here? And again, we're going to put some blame where blame is due. But the reality is that these actions by a few individuals have been used and politicized in ways that are so inappropriate. And as we've oftentimes said on this program, I'd rather not even talk about this for days if we could get away with it, because why can't we just mourn and just be saddened by the circumstances and the actions that have taken place? But that has not been left to us. And so in some respects, we shouldn't be totally surprised. Let's face it. Even when some of these shooters in the past, like the one in New Zealand, for example, has been linked back to Donald Trump, how you could think that the President of the United States had much influence on a person that was actually shooting people in New Zealand is a bit of a stretch, especially when in many cases, as we read these twisted manifestos of some of these shooters, we recognize that they are hardly Trump supporters. But in this case, the one that comes from Allen, Texas, looks like he might have been a little more sympathetic to him than most. But immediately you go to then the Dayton shooter's social media, in which he's saying, I'm going to hell and not coming back. I would happily vote for Democrat Elizabeth Warren. I want socialism. He's obviously not a Trump supporter there. So this is part of the problem, is that even when these individuals, troubled that they are, probably have not been influenced by the president in a positive or negative way, nevertheless, there is always the attempt to tie those individuals' actions back to those words. So we can go down that route, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. But let me try to see if we can come up with an explanation for back-to-back mass shootings. There have been a few of these, but this one, within 13 hours of each other, illustrates this only so well. Scientific American a while back put out this article called Mass Shootings Are Contagious. And what I'm going to do is read from the article we've posted. Because if you're used to reading science journals, and I had to do that in graduate school and still have to read them, you can kind of make your way through some of these almost impenetrable comments being made. But I think this article that comes out, interesting enough, by David Kupelian, who's been on the program with us before, is kind of a better summary. So I'm going to skip the first couple of paragraphs and get into the third paragraph where he said, in light of the close proximity of these two most recent mass shootings, as well as the mass shooting just days earlier, which would be, of course, the one in Gilroy, California, you've in about 7 days, in 1 week, had 3 shootings, resulting in that case of 3 dead and 12 injured. Considered the problem from a different vantage point, he says, one that casts the growing incidence of mass shootings in terms of contagion, or in more everyday terms, a copycat crime. You ever heard of a copycat crime? Of course you have. And so, interestingly enough, it's not a matter, he says, of mere speculation. In a 2015 peer-reviewed study, Contagion in Mass Killings and School Shootings, published in the Public Library of Science, which, by the way, is different than this one in Scientific American. So there are multiple studies. I'm just quoting 2 of many that have been done. They actually concluded that mass shootings are triggered by a similar attack. For example, we find that significant evidence that mass killings involving firearms are actually incented, it says, by similar events in the immediate past. On average, the temporary increase in probability lasts 13 days. We also find significant evidence of contagion in school shootings, for which an incident is contagious for an average of 13 days. On average, mass killings involving firearms occur approximately every 2 weeks in the U.S., while school shootings occur on an average of monthly. And so then it goes through and begins to, give you some documentation, and you can go all the way back to Parkland, Florida, and some of those. It goes through then the copycat phenomenon, it says, is real. This comes from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. They said, as more and more notable and tragic events occur, we think we're seeing more compromised, marginalized individuals who are seeking inspiration from these past attacks. The reality of copycat crimes, of course, is not new. Examples abound through history, from Jack the Ripper imitators all the way up to the 1980s. Remember the Tylenol murders and things of that nature. And so we've got lots of examples over these years of various kinds of copycat incidents. The Sandy Hook killer, for example, was actually enthralled by mass murderers and actually maintained a wall. If you've ever looked at that picture of infamous shooters, then you have, of course, some of the research there as well, which revealed that he not only was addicted to violent video games, having notched up more than 83,000 kills in his video game, including 22,000 headshots in the video game. He, in a sense, was training himself for the Sandy Hook massacre. So it helps you understand that this idea of a copycat or a contagion is something that has certainly been something that has been around for some time. And the article also goes on to explain that this idea of sort of mass murder madness isn't just an American phenomenon. You find it in the radical Muslim world as well. Jihad, the Islamic variety of mass murder madness, has proven itself so susceptible to copycat phenomenon that imitation may be the single most important factor involved, especially since, as he points out, jihadist cheerleaders and recruiters encourage just that. And so you can see, for example, that after the November 2015 coordinated terrorist attacks in Paris that killed 130, including 89 in the theater, concerns over copycats prompted the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security to send an urgent overnight bulletin to 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country, warning them to be on the lookout for suspicious people conducting surveillance on soft targets in the United States, looking, as they were, for lone wolf or self-radicalized terrorists, feeling that they could try to replicate the effects of the Paris attack. And, of course, that was well-founded because a few months later, in July of 2016, a Tunisian-born radical Muslim killed 86 people and wounded at least 430 by driving a 9-ton truck into a crowd in southern France, in Nice, during Bastille Day. And so, again, we have seen this wave of vehicular copycat attacks in Vienna, Berlin, London, Antwerp, Stockton, Paris, Barcelona, and Edmonton, not to mention another one that even happened in this country at Ohio State. That is the problem of contagion. We come back from the break. Let me try to explain one more example, and that is whether or not these mass shootings are a slow-motion riot. And then I want to, if I can, try to talk about what is the mindset. Are there any common characteristics of most of these shooters? And there are. Interestingly enough, an article that came out a while back, 26 of the 27 deadliest mass shooters had one thing in common. They came from broken homes, did not have a father. But that doesn't explain everything. You have to recognize that it's a collection of things that come together in a toxic kind of effect. Doesn't mean that if you are growing up with a single parent, or if you are addicted to video games, or if you have mental illness, that you're going to go out and shoot. But you put all that together, it's a pretty toxic mix, and we'll talk about that right after this.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate 2 replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. A good piece in the Wall Street Journal talked about the mass shootings in El Paso and Dayton that are horrifying assaults on peaceful communities by disturbed young men. And I want to get into that a little bit more. What is the cause for this? And the answer is there isn't one cause. Again, I find myself coming back to Jim Garrity time and time again. You know, of course, I already have admitted that probably more columns have been posted on the Point of View website by David French than any others. But if you look at some of the quotes I use so often, a lot of times they're from Jim Garrity. And I'll get into that in just a minute, because the editorial board of Wall Street Journal said, you know, that it's pretty obvious that the moment this takes place, there are going to be people wanting to use it for their political advancement. And they quote from an email that they received, and I may even have it on mine as well, from the Progressive Democrats of America, declaring, "We blame President Trump for feeding into the anti-immigrant frenzy and white supremacist violence. Yes, you, Mr. President, had your finger on that AK-47. And as they say, this is political cynicism. Mass shootings also occurred under Presidents Obama, Bush, and Clinton. By the way, I looked at the number of shootings under President Obama. I cannot remember everybody getting so outraged about some of his rhetoric, but nevertheless, we'll leave that as it is. It says they occur around the world, if much less frequently, in Christchurch, New Zealand, Australia, Norway. They're given all sorts of examples there that I'm sure had nothing to do with Donald Trump. And they said, take the El Paso shooter, who is suspected of writing a manifesto posted on the 8chan website before the rampage. By the way, can I mention something? 8chan website, that's where a lot of white supremacists go. They've taken it down. It's no longer going to be operational. That's probably something you didn't hear in the news as well. Anyway, he expressed sympathy for the racial motivations of the person in New Zealand and denounced Hispanic immigration. But also, even though this El Paso person has been identified as a Trump supporter, he also raged against unchecked corporations, sounds like Elizabeth Warren, and a variety of other groups as well. So, you know, even he didn't fit the stereotype perfectly, but after all, if you can blame the shooter in New Zealand, his actions for the rhetoric of Donald Trump, well, I see what it is. And I think the people in Wall Street Journal said, well, these columns have long warned Mr. Trump about the divisive tone of his public rhetoric. He should separate himself from the alt-right and white supremacist voters. And he says supporters will be correct that Mr. Trump's opponents will not reciprocate by pushing back against the irrational elements of the left, suggests that white supremacists should be called domestic terror groups. No problem there. Suggests that Antifa is supposed to be a domestic terrorist group and you in for a fight. So you know how that kind of plays itself out. But this one goes into some of the elements. And before we talk about the specific situations, on previous programs and in previous commentaries, my June of 2018 last year, I point out that Malcolm Gladwell, who is a man that I have such respect for, I've appreciated his books and his writings and things like that, he has argued that these mass shootings could be referred to as a slow motion riot. Borrowing from other sociologists, Malcolm Gladwell first argues that we should not look at these shootings in isolation, but see them as connected. And I just talked about how even in the last 13 hours, you had 2 different shootings, and in the last week, we've had 3 shootings. So they are connected, obviously, probably more so than we normally see them. But he also says we should understand that Columbine in Colorado actually set the cultural script. And the argument he's making is that Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold set the cultural script. They had a website, they made movies, they spelled out their motivations, they made it easier for potential shooters to follow their lead. And one study, as a matter of fact, found that a majority of school shooters in the 8 years after Columbine made explicit references to Harris and Klebold, and a majority of school shootings outside the United States were also versions of Columbine. So there is a sense when you're looking at school shootings that they're following the script. Now, we want to move from school shootings to mass shootings, and it's a little bit different, but it's the same argument. And the argument is, if you've ever been to a riot, I hope you've never had, but you've probably seen some on television, you know that there are a lot of people that would never throw a rock through a window. But the first time somebody throws a rock through a window, that then lowers the threshold for someone else to throw a rock through the window. There are a lot of people that would never loot a store, but as soon as somebody walks out with a stereo, a hi-fi, a television set, a computer, whatever it might be, guess what? More people do as well. Each successive action in a riot lowers the threshold so that other actions, which might not have been done, become more permissible. Does that make sense? And if you can understand that, then you can kind of see that we do have some characteristics that have played out in the lives of individuals. Let me, if I can, if nothing else, quote from Jim Garrity, but before I do, let me quote from Josh Greenman. Josh Greenman made a good comment the other day, and maybe I will write a commentary. After a while, you feel like you've said everything you can say about these things, but there's some new material every once in a while. And Josh Greenman put it this way: it's never just guns, it's never just mental health, it's never just radical ideology, it's never just sad manhood, it's always a toxic combination. So if you get this, you'll at least understand a little bit more. Okay, let's go to Jim Garrity. He said, often, but not always, there's no father in the home. Now, I appreciate that, but I have an article that came out a while back. 26 of the 27 deadliest mass shooters, that's up to last year, so this does not include these. But up until that time, 26 of the 27 deadliest mass shooters there actually came from fatherless homes. As a matter of fact, one individual put it this way: deeper even than the gun problem is this: boys are broken. And so, again, you can look at the CNN list of the 27 deadliest shootings. This is up until 2018, so it doesn't include the most recent ones. But only one was raised by his biological father since childhood. So, obviously, that's one factor. But again, as Jim Garrity points out, often, but not always, there's no father in the home. Often, but not always, the shooter has no friends or few friends and nothing resembling a real support network. Here's number 3. Often, but not always, the shooter is unemployed or barely employed. Then here's number 4. Often, but not always, the shooter has some mental health issue, sometimes formally diagnosed, sometimes not. Here's a 5th one. Often, but not always, the shooter played violent video games. Off air, we were just talking about the fact you raise that up, and boy, the whole world crashes down upon you. 6th, often, but not always, the shooter was active on extremist or Columbine-focused chat boards or had a noticeable interest in or obsession with previous mass shootings. And number 7, often, but not always, the shooter had gotten in trouble in school or had been kicked out of school. If you think about some of the shootings, whether it's in Connecticut, whether it's the shooting in Parkland, Florida, if it's even these most recent shootings in El Paso, Texas, Dayton, Ohio, or the earlier one in Gilroy, California, you see some really significant similar patterns. And so then Jim Garrity says that in every single case, when the shooter leaves some sort of message, it reveals that he has convinced himself that he is the real victim of powerful forces beyond his control, and that the only remaining option he sees for defiance is shooting as many random people as possible in a public place. And in every single case, the shooter manages to get his hands on a gun, sometimes legally purchasing them, and the one we know from El Paso actually was able to legally purchase that gun, sometimes stealing them or taking them from someone else. Only a handful of those who play violent video games become mass shooters, and the same is true for those without a father in the home, loners, unemployed, underemployed, those with mental health issues, those with discipline issues at school, or gun owners. But if enough of those traits are found in the same individual, we have a formula for trouble. So again, if you're going to make some comments out there on Facebook, and I'd recommend that you kind of cool it because there are too many stupid things that have been sent out on Twitter and Facebook. But if you do, help people understand that it isn't just one or two. It isn't just a broken home. It isn't just video games. It isn't just mental health. But if you put those 7 together, or any combination of those 7 together, you do have a toxic mixture that I think explains at least, if not most, perhaps even all of these in one way or another. And I thought I'd bring that to the table because we've never quite explained it in that way. And so if that was something new to the conversation, I'm glad you've been listening. We come back, I'm going to get into a couple of other issues that are relevant and worthy of your attention. We'll talk about this right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and then we're going to get into our conversation with Dr. Doug Groothuis and talk about Francis Schaeffer and a few other things. And a little bit later, we'll be talking with Alex Kendrick about this new movie, Overcomer. And then we'll get back into this issue of mass shootings. And of course, this will be the topic for a good portion of the week, so there will be a lot to cover. But how do you think about this theologically and spiritually? I could quote from our friend Jim Dennison, I already did. I could quote from Nick Pitts, which I already have. So let me quote from somebody else. Michael Ferris. He put together a very good piece because he said the horrendous events in El Paso, Dayton, and Gilroy give us pause, and we must ask why. He says guns aren't the cause. They were the instrumentalities, not the cause. Fertilizer was the weapon in Oklahoma City. Airplanes were the instrumentalities in 9/11. None of these things were the cause. It would be way too easy to say that there is a singular cause for all of those. I think we just answered that a minute ago. But he says one factor is apparent. These killers did not hold life to be sacred. We need to ask ourselves, does society hold life sacred? Do we individually hold life to be sacred? He says the fact that 4,000 babies die in Planned Parenthood offices and other clinics every day is the most glaring fact in such an analysis. The advent of euthanasia demeans the sacred character of life, and our entertainment involves an awful lot of killing. He says those who get behind a steering wheel impaired by alcohol or drugs do not hold life sacred, and there are countless other reckless actions that send a message, I don't think that your life and safety require me to be careful. But there is another level of analysis. For life to be sacred, we have to view human life as having a unique merit. The word sacred literally requires the imprint of God. Life is an unalienable God-given right. The Declaration of Independence says that inalienable is a legal term, meaning that no one can take it from me, nor can I voluntarily surrender it. The Judeo-Christian heritage views life in this manner. A few other religions and philosophies hold roughly similar views, but atheism struggles to find a philosophical path that leads to the sacredness of life. This is principally because the connection of evolution to atheism. If humans are a random cosmic accident, fundamentally no different than other life forms, human life is cheapened unless one resorts to the extremes of, he says, veganism. Pride, selfishness, arrogance, many other factors embellish the propensity to violence that arises when life is cheap. There are many other factors that can and should consider. We need a thoughtful national conversation about causes. But I fear all of this is likely to happen, that politicians will yell at each other about guns. Such opportunistic divisiveness is far closer to the cause than the cure. Life is in fact sacred because we are created in the image of God. Those of us who believe this need to join hands to figure this out. We will never solve it entirely, but we can and must make this whole lot better. Michael Ferris, great job. Well, we'll talk more about this in about 2 hours, but let me just take on one of the issues that I thought I might address on this time here in August. It's the first couple of days in August, and we're hearing one report after another saying that July 2019 was the hottest month on record for global average surface air temperatures. Now, since I'm broadcasting in Dallas, where a large number of you who are listeners live in Dallas, and you know we haven't had quite those 100-degree days, might not have felt like that. But nationwide and worldwide, we're getting all sorts of people. CNN, the BBC, Reuters, I'm sure Associated Press will join in shortly, all making the same statement. Last month was the hottest month in record. Is that true? Well, let me go to Dr. Roy Spencer, who's been on this program before, a climatologist, an expert, who says these official pronouncements of global temperature records come from a fairly limited and error-prone array of thermometers, which were never intended to measure global temperature trends. I'll just mention 3 since we're coming to a break. Number 1, many of these places where they're measuring the temperature are actually in the cities. I saw one where they were measuring the temperature right next to a parking lot. And that's number 1, what's called the urban heat island effect, that causes a gradual warming of most land thermometer sites due to the encroachment of buildings, parking lots, air conditioning units, and vehicles. And so in some respects, the urban heat island makes things look warmer than they really are and makes it look like global warming has taken place. Number 2, ocean temperatures, he says, are notoriously uncertain. And I thought, really? Because, ocean, that's a pretty good place you would think to measure that, until I found out how they do it. Really, this is the 21st century. They go out there in boats, they throw canvas buckets in overboard to get a sea surface temperature, and then you have to recognize that the ship engine water take temperatures buoys, satellite measures, and things like that, those things can obviously skew them a little bit as well. And I'm thinking, really, this is how we do this in the 21st century? Let me go on. The third one is that the whole idea of land and ocean thermometers and temperatures are notoriously incomplete geographically because, after all, 3/4 of our world, 3/4 of the Earth is surrounded by what? Water. We, at best, have 1 million square mile areas where there are no measurements taken at all. And so it's just a little bit erroneous, to put it mildly, to actually say that indeed July of this last month was the warmest temperature, warmest month in history. And so you might say, okay, smart guy, you're a climatologist. How would you do that? Well, I'm going to hold it up. Here's the map. We do have satellites, and we do have the way to measure, indeed, the entire planet, but we don't seem to want to do that. And for those of you watching online, I'll even hold it up to the screen a little bit better here. The blue are the places where the temperature is cooler than average. And since a lot of you are listening in either Dallas or Minnesota, you can see a very definite blue line that runs from Canada all the way through basically the eastern part of Texas. So you can see, yes, we did have cooler than normal temperatures. Haven't had a lot of 100-degree days, although I think by Friday we're going to be back to 100-degree days. And then you can see all sorts of blue, not only in land masses, but you can see blue in various ocean areas. And you can recognize that if indeed you want to use this standard evaluation worldwide of temperatures, then you can begin to check out temperature anomalies. So, nevertheless, I seem to spend half of my life trying to explain to people that there are no unicorns. You know, whether it is the argument that this is supposedly a country which has the greatest number of mass shootings, or whether it's the fact that July was the warmest month in history, if you just dig a little bit deeper and have a little bit of discernment, you find that some of these statements, which are headlines oftentimes in newspapers, are just not true. If they were, I'd tell you as well. I mean, I have no dog in this fight. I just simply say that sometimes these facts are wrong, and we would try to provide a service by telling you when they're wrong so that at least you have a little bit of understand of what is happening in the world around you. Let's take a break, though. Doug Groothuis is going to be with us. Dr. Doug Groothuis is a member of the Evangelical Theological Society, a professor at Denver Seminary, a former member of Pro Ministries, and an individual that has written a very good piece many years ago on the significance of Francis Schaeffer. So we've posted that if you'd like to read it. And maybe we'll learn a little bit more about apologetics and worldview from him. Then we'll get back into the shootings and the mass shooting that has taken place over the weekend. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
It wasn't long ago, it seemed, every official decision brought religious liberty and our ability to live as faithful Christians into question. Some of us wondered how long it would be before we were literally forced to choose between obeying God or men. That pressure seems to have subsided just a bit, and now is the time not to take a breath, but to work as hard as we can for the future of our nation. Thanks to you, Point of View is doing just that. And our special thanks to those who have become members of Truth Team 360. In football, 22 guys battle it out on the field while 40 or 60,000 watch in the stands and perhaps hundreds of thousands more watch on television. We need a special few to get out of the seats and into the game. Join today by calling 1-800-347-5151 and ask to join the Truth Team, or visit us online at pointofview.net/team. We really do need you. The nation needs you. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. If you were listening to the program on Monday, you know that I announced that we were going to have Dr. Doug Groothuis with us to talk about the significance of Francis Schaeffer. And we will do that, but over the weekend, I am not ignoring something that is very significant, and that is 30 people dead as a result of two different mass shootings, one in El Paso, Texas, one in Dayton, Ohio. This last hour on a local show, I spent an hour covering that, and we will come back to that topic again in about an hour. But I do believe that sometimes in the midst of all the charges and countercharges, the confusion, the misinformation, as well as the emotions, I do think I want to continue on with our conversation that we had scheduled today, and we'll do so. So if you have some comments about the shootings, and if you want to add to that, not only the one in El Paso, Texas, but also in Dayton, Ohio, also the one in Gilroy, California, we're going to get into some of that, and we do have an article on the mass shootings on our website, one on the so-called contagion effect, and I will have more to say about that a little bit later, as well as some other topics that are certainly relevant. We will be talking about that, but I wanted to, if I can, move forward with a conversation I've been looking forward to for some time, and that is a conversation with a good friend, Dr. Doug Groothuis, who is an individual that has worked in this area of worldview and apologetics for decades and has published lots of great books. For example, his book on Christian apologetics, Unmasking the New Age, Truth Decay, Philosophy in 7 Sentences, and the most recent book that we talked about last time he was on the program, Walking Through Twilight, A Wife's Illness, A Philosopher's Lament. Since that time, he has lost his wife, Becky, and has been remarried, so we'll talk about that in just a minute. Individual is a member of the Evangelical Theological Society, the Evangelical Philosophical Society, the Society of Christian Philosophers, a professor at Denver Seminary, holds a bachelor's and Ph.D. from the University of Oregon, a master's in philosophy from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and an individual that has been an instructor at such places as Westminster Theological Seminary, University of Oregon, and, of course, Denver Seminary. Doug Groothuis, always great to have you on the program with us.
Thank you, Kerby. I can't help but think about what's been happening in the country with all this mass violence. And I was just thinking a few minutes ago, how would Francis Schaeffer respond to this? And my first thought is that he would cry.
Sure.
He was a man of deep feeling and compassion, and he would try to get to the heart of the matter the best he could. But there's certainly a place for profound emotion when we look at tragedies like this and when we wonder what's going to happen next. He was a very engaged man with people personally, one-on-one, and also a very deep thinker. It's rare to find someone like that.
Well, again, we've had you on to talk about your wife, talk about jazz, as we have done. And I thought just for a minute we might update people, because we have, of course, chatted with you when your wife was still alive. You, of course, lost your wife, but you are remarried. And not only remarried, but you've been up there in Alaska. I'm going to be up in Alaska later this month, so I always kind of see what the temperature is like where you are. But I know that your new wife had a bit of a health scare. How's she doing now?
Yes, Kathleen's doing well. She has a pacemaker, and we had to unexpectedly have it replaced 2 weeks ago. But we were able to get into Anchorage. It's about normally an hour and a half drive. I made it a little more quickly without getting a speeding ticket. And she got an expert to help her, a real world-class physician. And so it all went swimmingly well. We felt guided and held by the Lord through it, and she's recovering well. So
you're good.
I'm grateful.
Let me just mention that we have a link to his website, and a lot of people, if they have one of his books, know how to spell his last name. But if you don't, the good news is we have a link to DougGroothuis.com. Also have links to various social media as well, so you will find that. And one of the articles I posted, Doug, was one that you wrote a while back called Francis Schaeffer, Pastor, Evangelist, Apologist, Prophet. So I was going to sort of use that to get into it. But before we do, let's just talk about the impact that Francis Schaeffer had on you and me. I'm with a group called Probe Ministries. You used to be with Probe Ministries. And frankly, I don't know if Probe Ministries would have existed without Francis Schaeffer. Two of the founders of Probe Ministries had been reading The God Who Is There and some of the other books by Francis Schaeffer, felt that there was really a need for Christians to develop and articulate a biblical worldview and to do apologetics in the classroom. And as a result, certainly were very influenced by him. When Francis Schaeffer came to Dallas on two separate occasions, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, and before that, How Should We Then Live? Probe was the sponsor of both of those groups. People that had worked with Francis Schaeffer actually helped us put some of those conferences on. We've had good ties to people like Oz Guinness and others. So he had a very profound impact on me and the organization I'm still with. But I know that you talk about the fact that I think in was the fall of 1976, you picked up one of the books, The God Who Is There, in a University of Oregon bookstore, and that was influential in your life as well, wasn't it?
Yes, I was a young Christian at the time. I just converted that summer, and I picked up this book with a very abstract cover. And I had heard of Schaeffer from a friend, but I had not read the books that she had loaned me for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
And I dug into that book, and I found a Christianity that, as I said in the article, has backbone, brain, muscle, guts, and heart. Schaeffer was a kind man, compassionate. He really cared about people who were lost, whose worldview did not give them adequate answers for life or meaning for life. And so he ranged over philosophy, theology, poetry, cinema. And the book also, I've been rereading it recently, is filled with personal anecdotes of where he is communicating the Christian faith to unbelievers. And you see this tremendous sensitivity and fellow feeling he had with unbelievers. So that book really helped define what I wanted to do as a Christian. I was 19 at the time, and I had just become a Christian. I wasn't quite sure how to think as a Christian. I had gotten involved with philosophy my first year of college and read the various philosophers and also studied Eastern religions. And I even attempted to be an atheist for a time because of reading Freud and Nietzsche and Marx, the great atheist thinkers in the 19th and 20th century. But Schaeffer really gave me a framework to fill in, or you might say gave me a foundation to build from.
Very good.
And I think it was, I get my jazz reference right, I think it was Dizzy Gillespie who said, without Charlie Parker, no Dizzy Gillespie, and I guess I could say without Francis Schaeffer, no Doug Groothuis.
Well, again, let's take a break. When we come back, you might even mention some other people that have been on this program, Nancy Piercy, Oz Guinness, John Whitehead, of course, those of us having the conversation. We recognize this may be a generation that knows not Schaeffer. We're going to clarify that, just as we've done in previous programs talking about people like C.S. Lewis. We'll continue our conversation about Francis Schaeffer right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Over the last few years, I've talked about how many times both sides of the political debate make wrong assumptions about each other. This misperception is certain to increase as we enter into this political season. Arthur Brooks provides further academic documentation for this reality. A study that appeared in the Journal of Politics revealed that the average Democrat believes that more than 40% of Republicans earn more than $250,000. That is a number that is completely wrong. Approximately 2% of Republicans are doing that well financially. The study also found that Republicans believe that a significant percent of Democrats are LGBTQ. Only 6% fit that designation. This misperception apparently is worse for liberals than for conservatives. Jonathan Haidt, in his book, The Righteous Mind, documented a detailed study of predictions liberals and conservatives would make about each other. He concluded that moderates and conservatives were more accurate in their predictions, whether they were pretending to be liberals or conservatives. Liberals were the least accurate, especially those described themselves as very liberal. That last point also shows up in the research cited by Arthur Brooks. The perception gap for the average Democrat or Republican is significant and concerning, but it pales in comparison to the most partisan in both parties. He reports that progressive activists and devoted conservatives are the most inaccurate in their perceptions of the other side. And they are driving much of the debate. Only 22% of U.S. adults are on Twitter, and 80% of the tweets come from 10% of the users. So he concludes that if we rely on Twitter for your political information, you're being informed by 2.2% of the population. This is one more reason for you to exercise great discernment in this election season. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Doug Groothuis is with us today as we talk about Francis Schaeffer, and in particular, one of the articles we've posted here, Francis Schaeffer, pastor, evangelist, apologist, prophet. And let's, if we can, Doug, maybe get some conversation going about his pastoral ministry, because in some respects, he was an individual that might have just stayed in the United States, but at one point his denomination requests that he go to Europe to investigate the church, and as a pastor began the idea of actually having a place over there in Switzerland. I'm just in Switzerland, so I have an understanding of kind of where he was, that would provide an opportunity for people that had skepticism and doubt, maybe those who were honest seekers. And so out of that little ministry, it became a worldwide ministry out of L'Abri. Tell us the rest of the story, if you might.
Yes. Schaeffer was a pastor for 10 years in the United States. And during that time, he and his wife, Edith, who was another exceptional Christian, started a ministry called Children for Christ, which was an evangelistic effort, a curriculum that's been used around the world. And the group that Schaeffer was with wanted him to investigate the state of the church in Europe after World War II. So Schaeffer went there and observed, did various interviews and so on. And it was discerned that he and his family should go to Europe. And eventually, Schaeffer reluctantly left the particular fundamentalist group that he was with, and they started this L'Abri ministry, which means L'Abri means shelter. And their basic goal was simply to be a place, a shelter for people who had doubts and questions and to exercise hospitality. And Schaeffer was a very thoughtful person. He was concerned about communicating truth to individuals in their culture. He was aware of history and art and so on. And all this began very organically, in a small way, in terms of loving God, loving truth, loving people, loving the Scriptures.
And one of the things I think is kind of interesting is when you read his books, you sort of hear him speaking, because in some respects what they did was take some of those tapes. Now, again, for my young listeners here, we used to have things called cassettes and cassette tapes, and they would transcribe some of those ideas. And so you could actually, if you had access to those cassettes or something like that, listen into the conversation. But his books really allowed you to sort of listen into the kind of questions that people were asking, and his attempt to try to pull all of that together in a comprehensive worldview.
Yes, his books have a conversational sense to them. They're not fuzzy. There was no fluff in this man whatsoever. But he was quite relational. And Oz says that Schaeffer was the best one-on-one evangelist and apologist that he has ever encountered. In fact, he said his books pale in comparison to what he would do sitting down and talking with a person, or sitting down and having a discussion with a group of people. So there's a real warmth about what he does, but it's not fuzzy-minded. It's not sentimental. I think it's the heart of the Lord that Schaeffer demonstrated to the world.
And one of the things you mentioned is he is not only, of course, we talked about this article, pastor, evangelist, apologist, prophet, but you kind of got into that idea of an evangelist. Os Guinness said he is kind of one of the best one-to-one evangelists. And yet, when we think of evangelism today, we think of steps to peace with God, 4 spiritual laws, whatever it might be, the Roman road, the 3 circles, those kinds of things. This was, in a sense, what he sometimes referred to as pre-evangelism. And I'd love to have you address that for just a minute, because there was a time not so long ago where most people had, even if nothing else, a remnant of the Christian worldview. So you could kind of assume that people believed in truth. They believed that there probably is a God. They may know something about Jesus. They may know something about the Bible. But Francis Schaeffer, I think, is the first person to help us understand that this is a very different world that we find ourselves in now, which is why he called it pre-evangelism. And the example I sometimes like to use is in Acts 13, when Paul's in the synagogue. He can assume all sorts of things that his Jewish listeners understand. But when we find him in Acts 17 in Athens, Mars Hill, he can't really assume much of anything. And Francis Schaeffer, I think, helped a lot of us understand that if you just use kind of the standard way we used to do evangelism, say a century ago, that standard way in which we did evangelism presupposed that your listeners would actually understand some of those concepts. And I think this is why he was so effective at recognizing, I've got to meet people where they are, define terms, understand what is kind of their hang-up, understand what's important to them, and then in the process share the good news. How would you respond to that?
Well, yes and amen. You really nailed what he wanted to do. He realized we needed to make Christian truth understandable and knowable to people who are not very familiar with it or had false understandings of Christianity. One of Schaeffer's passions was to challenge what's called fideism, or the idea that faith, belief in the Christian truths had no support from reason or evidence. You simply believed it, and you could not in any way verify it. And he talks about verifiable facts and knowing in the God who is there. And we need to emphasize that truth is objective. Christianity is true in the sense that God is in fact there. That's what makes the Bible true. That's what makes our faith significant, is that we are believing the truth of God, the God who is there, the God who's revealed himself in nature, in Scripture, and in Christ. But in many cases, you have to start pretty far back. So if someone says, I think truth is whatever gives me a personal sense of meaning, we have to challenge that concept of truth before we get to Christianity as the truth. And Schaeffer says the gospel doesn't start with accept Jesus as your Savior. Really, as a worldview, the gospel starts with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Yes.
So unless you have a strong understanding of the distinction between the infinite personal creator and the finite personal creation, you can't even get to first base in terms of evangelism and conversion.
I might just mention, too, that a book that I highly recommend all the time is your book, Truth Decay, which really gets into this idea of postmodernism, because, as you know, Doug, we have people saying, well, you have your view of truth, and I have my view of truth, and somebody else has a different view of truth, and we'll all just hold hands and sing Kumbaya, and there's really no need for us to believe in absolute truth. And you take that issue upon that issue, begin to take it apart in a biblical sort of way. And that's kind of key, because if you don't start with some kind of basic assumptions about truth, about evidence, about the reality of the world, it's going to be a kind of a tough slog if you're going to be involved in any kind of evangelism.
Well, that's certainly the case. And I think of one of Schaefferisms. He had a number of them. He talked about true truth.
Yes.
So what he meant by that really was objective truth, or a statement is true if and only if it corresponds to reality. And you might think, well, isn't that obvious? But it is not obvious. And we need to argue for it, and we need to clarify just what Christianity is claiming. It's not simply a story or something that gives meaning to groups of people over time. It is that. But it would say the final screen of reality is the infinite personal God, God who is there, and who is a God who speaks to us. That idea of God speaking, God communicating, was extremely significant for Schaeffer, because he was much of the time to the hippie culture, to the counterculture, and there was this tremendous problem of communication. How do we know anything about other people? What happens after we blow our minds? Do we have anything left to say at all? And Schaeffer said that God is a God who sympathizes with us. We communicate with each other, and God has communicated to us. We don't have to take some mystical leap into non-reason to have a religious experience. We can know who God is propositionally, truths about God, and we can also know God personally. There's no dichotomy there, relationally.
Yeah. Again, in his book, He is There, He is Not Silent, was certainly another aspect of that. Let's take a break. We'll come back. And again, we also talk about Francis Schaeffer as an apologist and a prophet. And certainly that is another aspect. But if you'd like to join us, perhaps you have heard the name Francis Schaeffer. Maybe he has had an influence in your life as well. We'd love to hear from you. 1-800-351-1212. If you'd like to join the conversation today with Dr. Doug Groothuis. But also, let me just mention, we have a link to douglasgroothuis.com. And you can find that on our website. We'll be right back.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests, by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Douglas Groothuis, and if you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talking about Francis Schaeffer. Next hour, we're going to have a chance to hear from Alex Kendrick for a little bit about this new movie, Overcomer, and then we'll get into, of course, the shootings that have taken place over the weekend, and, of course, that will probably dominate a lot of our conversation this week, so there's no rush in trying to get to all of that, but we will certainly try to cover those issues. And I might just mention we've posted a couple of articles about the shootings, about the so-called contagion effect. And if I can, I'm also going to try to deal with and maybe set aside a couple of the false statements that have been made in the media in that regard. If you'd like to know more about Douglas Groothuis, you can go to douglasgroothuis.com. We have a link on the website, so you don't even have to know how to spell his name. You will find, again, all sorts of books and publications, reviews, articles, media, and the rest. And so please take the time to visit our website, pointofview.net. One of the articles we posted, Francis Schaeffer, pastor, evangelist, apologist, prophet. Let's talk about apologist. You know, when we talk about apologetics and we talk about defending the Christian faith, oftentimes we're talking about evidence and the Bible. Dr. Schaeffer spent some time really helping us understand how culture and worldview come together. I remember Charles Thaxton, Dr. Charles Thaxton said the first time he read one of those books about the flow of Western culture, he said, if this is true, this changes everything. And it really does. And even in your article here, he used the example of John Cage and many of the other examples from art and music and history. And today I have noticed, Doug, that when you go to the classrooms of many of these Christian schools that teach a classical Christian education, they'll have a timeline. They'll spend a fair amount of time talking about some of these areas of history, art, music, and the rest. And I think at least part of that is, if nothing else, something that was a result of the good work that Francis Schaeffer did in some of his writings early on, and even in his seminal book, How Should We Then Live?
I think you're right. Schaeffer was concerned with the history of ideas, and he painted with a pretty broad brush sometimes. And some of his judgments, I think, were a bit off. Some of the things he said about Thomas Aquinas, for example. However, he was able to chart the drift of culture, especially the secularization of philosophy and how ideas affect culture in terms of philosophy and art, general culture, theology, and so on. And he gave us tools to evaluate ideas, basically test for any set of ideas, any worldview is non-contradiction. You can't claim something is true and have it contradict reality and have a good truth claim. A worldview has to match reality. It needs to be open to verification, to falsification, and it also needs to give meaning to life. If you have a worldview in which there's no meaning, or to act as if there were meaning is to go against reality, then your worldview is very unsatisfactory. So you mentioned John Cage. Perhaps people don't know of him now. He was an avant-garde composer, really rather nihilistic in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
But he tried to compose music on the basis of chance. He tried to get the human element out of the way. So he would use the I Ching, the Chinese method of divination. He would throw the I Ching to, quote-unquote, compose music. But there was a long article on John Cage years ago, I think it was in the New Yorker, where it emphasized that Cage was an amateur mycologist. That is, he was an expert on mushrooms. And he said, if I applied my chance philosophy to eating mushrooms, I would quickly die. So when you get to mushrooms, you've got to figure out truth versus falsity. Right? You've got to figure out what's going to taste good and what's going to kill me. In fact, what tastes good might kill you. So you've got to know the distinction between what is nourishing and what is poisonous. But when he was composing music, he tried to throw that out the window. He tried to get rid of personality. And one of the strong themes in Schaeffer's work is that God is an infinite, personal, and triune being. Schaeffer talks about personality at the high level of the Trinity. God is one God in three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, and they have an eternal interrelationship of perfect love. And that's the basis for love and meaning in the world. So when someone like a John Cage or someone else tries to be a human being and create art while throwing out personality, the result is very ugly and very damaging. But Schaeffer was never someone to rub someone's nose their meaninglessness. He had concern and had compassion. And I guess it was a couple of years ago, I went to an art gallery, and the artist was displaying her work, which combined woodwork and industrial machines. It was very odd, and I was able to talk to her a little bit and look at her website, and I found out that she was trying to use the same philosophy as John Cage. She was trying to get her personality out of the way when she created. Well, it failed, because obviously her works were works of a human being who was creating things. But I wrote her a note on her webpage saying that she was a human being and she was using personality, and her personality is really basic to the universe. I don't remember everything I said, but it was Schaeffer's insights that gave me some common ground with this non-Christian artist. And so people read The God Who's There and they think, well, I've never heard of John Cage or Marcel Duchamp. It's significant to know about these people historically, but you can apply the categories of analysis that Schaeffer used to contemporary artists and contemporary philosophers, whether they are nationally known, globally known, or just people in the art district in your city.
And one of the things I think is interesting is in his book, he talked about taking the roof off, because that was the idea of showing people the logical connections, the logical outcome of their view. If you take the roof off, the rain comes in, and the same idea that he would say, well, if you believe in naturalism, if you believe that nature is all that there is, yet you say you believe that human life is sacred, well, how do you? Because if naturalism is true, if evolution is true, then you're just a biological oddity. You're a cosmic accident. Where do you get this idea of the sacredness of human life? Well, we do as Christians because we believe we're created in the image of God. So he spent a fair amount of time really pointing out, as you just pointed out a minute ago with John Cage, the contradictions of your worldview. And the argument you would make is that a biblical worldview, if it's based upon the Bible and based upon God, it's not going to have those contradictions that all the others actually do have. But just before we take a break, let's talk about one other aspect of Francis Schaeffer, and that is he made a distinction that we in the modern world oftentimes separate the upper story, that's faith, from the lower story, which is fact and logic. And Nancy Pearcey's been on this program a number of times in the past talking about that, but that's another issue where people today sort of even buy into that, and you'll have individuals saying, well, yeah, that's a faith decision. You can't exercise faith. You can't tell me that you think this area of genetic engineering or abortion is wrong, because we're just looking at facts. And that's just another aspect of a legacy of Francis Schaeffer. So when we come back, I want to maybe talk about that. And then, of course, that leads naturally into the fourth and final characteristic, pastor, evangelist, apologist, prophet. And he certainly was a prophet when he wrote, of course, his book, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, as well as some of these other books looking at some of the political issues. And he really kind of could see from a distance the world that we find ourselves in today. So, again, if you'd like to know a little bit more about Francis Schaeffer, we have posted that article that Doug Groothuis has written. If you'd like to know a little bit more about some of his articles and some of his books and other things, those are all available. I might commend to you a couple of those. Walking Through Twilight, A Wife's Illness is, again, just a powerful book. And then one that he's referred to as one where he has a fair amount of humor in it, Philosophy in 7 Sentences. Kind of his opus is on Christian apologetics. And then if you really want to understand anything about the New Age movement, and right now with Marianne Williamson being one of the most searched people on the internet because of some of the things she's been saying in the Democratic debate, you can certainly find some of the articles and various books written by Doug Groothuis on the New Age movement. And those are all available on his website. And, of course, a lot of those are easily found in your bookstore or even on some of the online bookstore sites. But let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Douglas Groothuis right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Douglas Groothuis with us for a few more minutes. And again, Doug, let's, if we can, maybe talk about this dichotomy between the upper story and lower story. As I mentioned before, Nancy Pearcey, Chris Overman, and others have been on the program talking about this. And I think almost anybody can relate to this idea that we almost sort of put anything having to be in faith in the upper story, everything having to do with our lives in the lower story. And I think that explains a lot of why we have individuals that sort of look like Christians in church on Sunday, but they don't look like Christians when they go into the workforce, when they go in the political realm, when they don't actually take their Christian worldview out into the world. Is that fair?
Well, it's a deep problem, and Schaeffer analyzed it in terms of the history of ideas, and he was helpful in that. Some people think that matters of faith are entirely different than matters that could be argued for. So if you have faith in something, then that means there's no historical or scientific support or psychological support for it. Now, Schaeffer said that's a false dichotomy. A biblical view is that we should have Christ at the center of our worldview. That is, there's a circle of knowledge, and we gain knowledge from Scripture, we gain knowledge from science, from history, from our own inner lives, and all of those cohere. There's a unity of truth. So I'm even a bit reluctant sometimes to use the word faith in a non-Christian setting.
Yes.
Because people tend to think a belief that is not supported by reason.
Mm-hmm. That's
so if
right.
that's the case, then why bring faith into the marketplace of ideas when it can't be supported? So I'd rather talk about truth claims and the evidence and support for truth claims. And when we enter the marketplace of ideas, we enter the political situation, let's say on the pro-life issue, we give reasons why we think human beings have value and significance. And we don't just say, well, my faith tells me that an unborn human has value. We can give arguments based on sound principles. Of course, we can give arguments for the whole Christian worldview. And once we've established that, then what Scripture says has things to address on people. But the real issue is truth. Do we have a knowledge of the way the world is? Can we back up what we believe? Can we enter this world of debate? And be willing, as Schaeffer said, to give blows and receive blows. So if we are arguing against, let's say, a naturalistic view of the world that you mentioned earlier, say the universe is designed and created, well, naturalists will argue back against us. And we should be willing to have a response to whatever comes our way. We need to make Christianity a public issue and not simply a matter for a closed faith community. Certainly, we have our worship and prayer, and we have the language we use in the church, and so on. But we need to communicate all this to the broader world because, as Schaeffer said over and over again, the lordship of Christ, the authority of Christ, covers the whole of life, and it covers the whole of life equally.
Let me just real quickly, before I run out of time, talk about his role as a prophet. And when you read some of the later works, whatever happened to the human race, certainly very relevant, even earlier than that, How Should We Then Live? And, of course, his Christian Manifesto, he saw a lot of this coming. And as a result, it is important for us to recognize that not only do we observe what is happening in the culture, but we have to give a prophetic announcement and judgment to what is happening in the culture. That's certainly a number of things that I know you've done, and certainly what we try to do here on Point of View. But that role of prophet was very key, especially in the latter years for Francis Schaeffer, wasn't it?
It was, and you even see it earlier in his book, Death in the City, which is really a reflection on passages in Jeremiah and Romans. Without God at the center of life, you find death in the city, actually death everywhere. So we need to be able to speak the truth in love, and do so from an informed and compassionate perspective. But there's an old phrase that I think should be very powerful for Christians, and that is speaking truth to power. And we want to speak a divinely authorized truth about the value of human life, whether we're talking about the unborn or innocent people in a shopping center, about immigrants or those towards the end of their life or those who are handicapped. We want to speak the truth in love about the dignity of the human person before God, and where we see indignity and dehumanization, we need to speak out. And there's a place for reason argument, as I said. Schaeffer was masterful at that. But in some cases, we simply have to pronounce that certain things are evil and wrong and need to change. So a prophet has backbone. A prophet doesn't have to yell, but a prophet has insights, and a prophet can also see the direction that things are moving in. And I guess now, how many years after Schaeffer died in 1984, so much of what he was concerned about, especially about abortion and infanticide and euthanasia, has come to pass. And also his concerns about the curtailing and minimizing of religious liberty. These concerns have certainly been major issues ever since he wrote about them, and they still are, especially with the LGBTQ movement and the desire to, in many cases, silence a Christian voice on these issues.
Well, again, we've been talking with Douglas Groothuis. If you'd like to know more about him, douglasgroothuis.com. This article is one of the articles we post. I think it's the third article on our website. And it takes about 5 pages of your printer to print out, but I would encourage you to read it and to educate yourself on that. And for some of you young people that say, I've never even heard of this individual, you can see the profound impact that he has had on not only our lives around the table here, but some of the other individuals like Oz Guinness and Nancy Piercy and John Whitehead and others that have been on the program with us. So if you want to understand where these ideas come from and how we've used those in evangelism, apologetics, and giving a prophetic witness, I think you'll want to read that article. So, Doug, thank you for joining us once again here on Point of View. Look forward to talking with you again about some of the other books that you have written and other books you plan to be writing. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Okay, you're welcome. Thank you, Kerby.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, first of all, we're going to chat for just a few minutes with Alex Kendrick. You may be familiar with the Kendrick brothers. I mean, I can't imagine that you're not. How about War Room, Courageous, Fireproof, Facing the Giants, just to mention a few. New movie out called Overcomer, so I thought it would be good for you to know a little bit about that movie because we always want you to have access to really good resources, and it's, again, an opportunity for you to go to the movie theater, go to that movie, send a signal to Hollywood. We're looking for more of these faith-friendly, family-friendly movies, so we'll talk with him for a few minutes. And then we'll get into, of course, the fact that 30 people have died in mass shootings, both in Texas and Ohio. When you add to it, of course, even what happened in California, we've got a crisis on our hands. We're going to talk about what that means. One of our articles is kind of a summary of the shootings, another on the contagion effect. And then before it's all through, I want to spend a little bit of time critiquing and maybe dismissing a couple of facts and figures that aren't facts and really need to be reevaluated. So that's one of the things that we're going to do in the next hour. Of course, this is something we'll be talking about for much of the week, so I didn't feel the need to try to get to it right away, but we're going to come back. And, of course, if you have comments about the statements by the president about gun control, about the circumstances that these young people found themselves in, why is this happening? That's all fair game. So let's take a break. We will get into all of that right after these important messages.
There is no more dangerous time than when things are going well. Remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? Fire came down. There was no doubt who was God, but what happened next? He went from amazing faith to a time of great fear and depression. Many Christians have been very thankful a certain Democratic candidate for president was not the one to nominate 2 replacements for the Supreme Court. But as with Elijah, times of great victory are also times of great danger. Moments like this are not the time to take it easy. This is not the time to let our guard down. This is a time to double down on our work in the community, to serve and pray and plan and invest in a better future. This is the time to join Point of View's Truth Team 360 to make sure today's promising gains are not lost tomorrow. Show your commitment to our future by visiting pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. Ask to join the Truth Team. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View,
and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me this hour. We're going to spend some time getting into, of course, the shootings over the weekend. 30 people died in 2 mass shootings in Texas and Ohio. And if you add the one in California less than a week ago, certainly we are going to focus some time and attention on that. But before we do so, we wanted to, as we always do here on Point of View, alert you to a movie that you need to go to, that you need to take a group to, and you need to really send a signal to Hollywood that we want more of these faith-friendly, family-friendly films, and this is the new film called Overcomer. It is one that comes from our good friends, the Kendrick brothers, Alex Kendrick with us, and of course you are familiar with some of the other films like Facing the Giants, Fireproof, Courageous, War Room, and of course this newest one here, Overcomer. Of course, he has been in many of those films, and of course, he is an active member at Sherwood Church, he and his family, and joins us now by phone. Alex, welcome back to Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby. Great to talk to you.
Well, thank you so very much for doing all these great films, and we have a link on our website to overcomermovie.com. We always encourage people to click on the blue button to find theaters, get tickets. There's a red button there so you can take your group as early as August 5th. Oh, I look at my calendar. It's August 5th, so you can actually get involved there. There is a place where you can watch the trailer. But I thought it was kind of interesting because every one of your films have a theme. This one really fits hand in a glove with the New Testament because it has to do with running. And if you think about this, how many times the Apostle Paul used the Athenian games to emphasize and talk about what the Christian life is, or the writer of Hebrews, might have been Paul, might have been somebody else, talks about to run the race with endurance. The actual Greek word could be translated with agony or agonizo. So in some respects, this film fits even better in terms of some of the biblical themes, doesn't it?
You know, there's a great parallel between running a long race and even the Christian walk, because there are days you feel like, hey, I'm running downhill, the wind's blowing, everything's great, and other days you feel like you're running uphill and you're tired and you're ready for that second wind. And running through culture is similar. So we all want to finish well, and we want to honor God in the process. So yeah, there's a lot of parallels there.
Well, you had to learn a little bit about running, didn't you? And run some yourself, didn't you? Talk about that.
Yeah, we did. All of my 6 kids run cross country, and we've won state championships, and I've enjoyed watching that. And at the same time, I saw the endurance that it took to persevere and to finish well, cross the line well. And I want to do that in my Christian life. But this movie follows a cross-country runner, and she's struggling with asthma and struggling with who she even is, where her place is in the world. And her coach, who lost his basketball team and is forced to coach cross-country, really didn't want to at the beginning. And he's struggling with who am I when I can't find success? And so the movie asks the question, what have you allowed to define you? And we tackle the issue of identity and culture, and more specifically, what it means to have your identity in Christ.
And if I just mentioned, of course, you're in the film. Priscilla Shirer is with us. Of course, I've known her since Tony Evans is just down the road, and he's been on the program many times, seen actually a lot of the kids in that family grow up. And this has been just pretty amazing. You know, she was outstanding in War Room, also in Overcomer. And if nothing else, this has been a platform for you to launch new movie stars.
Well, we love Priscilla. She's fantastic, and we love launching people for greater exposure, who are honoring God and using their gifts and abilities to reflect Him. And we're not just interested in building movie stars. We want people to use this platform for good. And so we hope to do the same thing with everyone that's in our films. And hopefully when people go see the film, they're not just entertained, but they're better for it and asking themselves the right questions when they leave.
Let's talk about how to use the film, because as you have heard us talk about on this program before, we encourage people to find out where a theater is that is available. I have many times had my Sunday school class see if we could just rent out the whole theater or most of it, so that can be an opportunity for them to show up and even invite some of their friends. But talk about what is available as we go to the website overcomermovie.com, because there are some great resources there and some ways in which right now listeners who are saying, oh, I didn't even know about the film, or I've heard a little bit about it, but I don't know much about it. How can they get involved and get their friends, neighbors, and coworkers all involved?
Well, it is that kind of movie. We wanted to make a film that you could take your whole family to, and it would be great to take relatives, peers, coworkers, neighbors, because ultimately we want to touch a generation. It's not just about entertainment, though it is entertaining, but we want to send a message that God loves you, wants a relationship with you, and that He is the source and the truest source of our identity. So you can buy a theater out and take people as soon as today. And the movie comes out wide on August the 23rd, and that's an important weekend because if it does well, then they begin adding theaters, which means more people have the opportunity to see it and be ministered to by it. But you can go to overcomermovie.com to find out where the theaters are. We'll have about 1,600 to 1,700 theaters on opening weekend, August 23rd. And again, we have resources on that site, overcomermovie.com. And again, we want to not only send a message to Hollywood, but encourage the church and use this as a tool to reach those that need a walk with God.
Again, like I said, in theaters August 23rd, but you can take your group as early as August 5th, so that's right where we are today, so that gives you a chance to do that. But put this in perspective, because as you scroll down, you have a picture of all the other films that you've been involved with. So this whole idea of filmmaking has been something that has been very important to both of you and the whole Kendrick family, right?
It is. You know, that's something that we felt called to years ago. And every time we do a film, we are amazed at the response. We're amazed at what God does with it. They go to about 76 countries on cable and DVD and other sources. And we hear every single day from people that the movies have touched in one way or another, men that are going back to their wives, fathers who are stepping up saying, I need to be the spiritual leader of my home. And, of course, now we're praying that an entire generation, not only in the church but beyond, will learn to find their identity in the one who created them. So we're very excited about this outlet. We're learning to make the movies at higher production values, higher levels of excellence. This is our best film in that regard. We have the best equipment, cameras. The whole scope of the film is larger than we've ever done before, so we hope that is reflective on the screen. And, again, we'll keep working hard to make movies at a higher level of excellence, but these themes are things that our culture needs to hear, and we really hope to touch their heart with it.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll chat for just another minute or two about kind of where this is and how you could use any one of those other films as well, Facing the Giants, Fireproof, Courageous, War Room, and, of course, this one, Overcomer. And then we'll get into some of the topics that we have on the table today. Alex Kendrick with us, and if you find yourself saying, I'd like to get a little bit more information, that's why we have a link to overcomermovie.com. We'll also be announcing it as we get closer to its release date, how you can get involved and how you can use this as an evangelistic outreach, as a way to maybe encourage young people, and how you can use some of the other resources that have been made available from the Kendrick brothers. But let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Alex Kendrick for another couple moments, and then get into all sorts of issues that we need to address today, especially in light of these mass shootings that have taken place over the weekend. So we'll come back and continue our conversation right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Over the last few years, I've talked about how many times both sides of the political debate make wrong assumptions about each other. This misperception is certain to increase as we enter into this political season. Arthur Brooks provides further academic documentation for this reality. A study that appeared in the Journal of Politics revealed that the average Democrat believes that more than 40% of Republicans earn more than $250,000. That is a number that is completely wrong. Approximately 2% of Republicans are doing that well financially. The study also found that Republicans believe that a significant percent of Democrats are LGBTQ. Only 6% fit that designation. This misperception apparently is worse for liberals than for conservatives. Jonathan Haidt, in his book, The Righteous Mind, documented a detailed study of predictions liberals and conservatives would make about each other. He concluded that moderates and conservatives were more accurate in their predictions, whether they were pretending to be liberals or conservatives. Liberals were the least accurate, especially those described themselves as very liberal. That last point also shows up in the research cited by Arthur Brooks. The perception gap for the average Democrat or Republican is significant and concerning, but it pales in comparison to the most partisan in both parties. He reports that progressive activists and devoted conservatives are the most inaccurate in their perceptions of the other side. And they are driving much of the debate. Only 22% of U.S. adults are on Twitter, and 80% of the tweets come from 10% of the users. So he concludes that if we rely on Twitter for your political information, you're being informed by 2.2% of the population. This is one more reason for you to exercise great discernment in this election season. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Alex Kendrick with us for just a few more minutes as we talk about this movie coming out, Overcomer. And again, if you have not gone to the website, I would encourage you to do so, overcomermovie.com. I clicked on the button there that said Find Theaters and just wanted to see those in my particular area. And it just scrolled down page after page of various opportunities. So, Alex, lots of opportunities, but I thought for just a minute before I let you go, I know we have a number of listeners that have been very encouraged and motivated by your success with these movies. And they said, you know, maybe there's a possibility as a young person for me to maybe be an actor, maybe a screenwriter, maybe work in a film, be a director someday, whatever that might be. Are there some lessons maybe you've learned going from starting out in this business to now being so successful that you could pass on to some of us?
And we are passing those things on. You know, we regularly go to events like the Christian Worldview Film Festival in NRB, and we speak regularly and share what we're learning. We also, with every film we do, we get about 20 young film student interns to come on set.
Great.
We want to make these kinds of films, and we pour into them throughout the course of the filmmaking. We pair them up with some of the professionals in each of the areas of the crew and cast and help them. So we are passionate about investing in the next generation and passing the torch, and that's very important to us. So, they can go to the Christian Worldview Film Festival. That takes place in Tennessee every year. And then we also support the Lee University, Liberty University, North Greenville University, their film programs with some donations and scholarships and things like that. So we love doing that and want to see more people jump into this arena.
Well, again, it's so exciting to see because you know as well as I do that as you've been able to develop this and get bigger budgets, You've been able to do more in terms of production values and those kinds of things, and, of course, learning the craft. And so this is a point where, without hesitation, you can invite somebody who maybe is a seeker or somebody who's just open to watching a movie and not say, okay, you may have to overlook a few problems here or a few plot issues or some of the production values, because now these are such professional films. So, again, just kudos to you and to the Kendrick brothers. But one last time, let's, if we can, talk about how people can get involved. Again, it shows up in the theaters August 23rd, although I saw some of the theaters here said they might even have a preview on August 22nd. But between now and the end of the month, what can our listeners do in order to make sure that they can have a good opening weekend for Overcomer and also get individuals into those theaters?
So we are always grateful for prayer. Ultimately, we can make a movie, but only God changes the heart. So we want the Lord to do what only He can do. But you can get your sports teams together, youth groups together, your church congregation together, and buy out theaters by going to overcomermovie.com. Find a theater in your area and buy out those theaters. And it's crucial that we do that on opening weekend. Again, our distributor has chase money available. What that means is, if we have a strong opening weekend, they begin adding that chase money, and they go after more theaters and wider distribution. For them, it is business-driven. For us, it's ministry-driven, and we want as many people as possible to hear this hopeful and encouraging message of finding your identity in Christ, and the gospel's presented in the film as well. So we're passionate about that, and these entertaining movies carry this tremendous message, and again, we want to get it out to as many people as possible. So overcomermovie.com, and then to get people together and buy out these theaters and go support it, especially opening weekend, is crucial.
And I love your idea. I hadn't even thought about that. Churches, small groups, but even sports groups. Maybe your child or your grandchild is involved with Fellowship of Christian Athletes. Think about this as another outreach, and just a great opportunity for us to get individuals in those seats to see a film that is going to encourage their faith and to really help them begin to think about their identity. What do you allow to define you? And that's one of the sub-themes of Overcomer. So, Alex Kendrick, always great to have you on the program. Thank you so very much.
Bless you, Kerby. Thanks.
We're going to, just before we take a break, get into now some of the other issues that have sort of been in our minds all weekend. One of the plans that I had last Friday was that on Monday we would spend some time, as we did in the first hour, talking with Dr. Doug Groothuis about Francis Schaeffer. And I knew we would be talking about Alex Kendrick. And I had all sorts of other things I was going to talk about today. But I think we all know how we felt on this weekend. Jim Dennison, and I had his son on Friday with us, said, in his particular daily article, that horror, anger, grief, anguish, heartbreak, mourning, shock, those were, he said, some of the emotions that we had when we actually saw these two mass shootings. But I thought it was kind of interesting. He said surprise was not one of them, which I think is one of the great tragedies of these tragedies, because we've seen these happen too many times. Now, Jim Dennison, a little bit later in his daily article, says that there have been 251 mass shootings in America this year, and yet I have ABC News saying that there have been 18 deadly mass shootings in the U.S. so far in 2019, which I think illustrates one of the things I want to get to a little bit later after the break, and that is the very significant disparity between some of the kinds of comments that are being made and some of the kinds of statistics being surfaced. And if there's anything we've wanted to try to do here at Point of View, it's really to encourage you to spend a fair amount of time evaluating some of the things you see, read, and hear, to have some level of discernment. And the disparity between ABC News saying 18 deadly mass shootings and then this statistic, which of course is cited by Jim Dennison, which comes out from various groups of 251 mass shootings, should be, if nothing else, a tip-off that you need to pay attention to some of those facts and figures. And we will spend some time a little bit later this hour getting into that as well. But also, one of the articles we've posted here today is on this whole idea of contagion, Now, a while back, I'd read an article, hold this up for those of you that are watching online, and this is from Scientific American, and it's more of an academic article, which is entitled Mass Shootings Are Contagious. And that one's sort of academic, so I instead decided to post another piece that is by David Kupelian, which actually quotes from another study that appeared in Public Library of Science. But interestingly enough, as he points out, he said, in light of the close proximity of these two most recent mass shootings, as well as the mass shootings just 6 days earlier in the Garlic Festival in Gilroy, California, resulting in 3 dead and 12 injured, consider the problem from a different vantage point, one that casts the growing incidence of mass shootings in terms of contagion, or to use everyday terms, a copycat crime. And in there, he said, it's not really a matter of speculation. That one study he's quoting from there is called Contagion in Mass Killings and School Shootings. And that's where the researchers concluded that we find significant evidence that mass killings involving firearms are incented by similar events in the immediate past. On the average, this temporary increase in probability lasts 13 days. We also find significant evidence of contagion in school shootings, for which an incident is contagious for an average of 13 days. And on average, mass killings involving firearms occur approximately every 2 weeks in the U.S., while school shootings occur on an average of monthly. And the point he's making is that we have seen this with the school shootings in particular. You can go back to the Sandy Hook killer, who actually had on his wall all sorts of infamous shooters. And then we find out from the research that was done that they found that young man that killed those in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, was addicted to violent video games, having notched up more than 83,000 kills on his video games, including 22,000 headshots on those video games, and seemed to be fixated with researching mass killers. So when we come back from the break, I want to talk a little bit more about that. What is it, or are there a series of things that maybe can be explained? I think there is not a one-size-fits-all answer, but I think if we put all of these together, and if you're taking some notes, we'll talk about, when we come back from the break, 7 different things. And when you have people say, well, it's only video games, or it's only fatherlessness, or it's only that they were loners, or it's only that they had mental health problems. No, some are, some aren't. But if you put some of those together, you begin to have an explanation. And so I just wanted to bring a couple of new things to what has become kind of a tired, routine conversation, which it should not be. And as, again, Jim Dennison said, if there's anything that it shouldn't be routine, and we should be shocked and surprised. Sadly, it's happened too often. And maybe we can try to understand some of the causes right after these important messages.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you would like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. I'd like to hear some of your thoughts, and those thoughts are important because we're all trying to make sense of some of this. One of the reasons I posted as our second article today on the website on contagion is because I think that is something that we're kind of wondering about in light of two shootings within 13 hours of each other. If you add the Gilroy, California shooting to the El Paso, Texas shooting and the Dayton, Ohio shooting, you recognize that these are connected. And if you would like to read more about this whole idea of this not only being contagion, but what Malcolm Gladwell called a slow motion riot, a year ago on June 2018, I wrote about that. Malcolm Gladwell, I've really thought very highly of some of his books, but he says we're in the midst of what you might call a slow motion riot. Borrowing from some of the works of other sociologists, he said that when you look at this, you should not look at these shootings in isolation, but see them connected. Second, you need to understand that Columbine, Colorado really set the cultural script, and understand that how each action lowers the next threshold. Let me take the last one first. If you've ever watched a riot on television, you notice that sometimes nobody throws a rock, but as soon as somebody throws a rock, somebody else is willing to throw a rock through a window. You might say no one has been looting, but as soon as somebody does run out with a TV set or a stereo, then all of a sudden that lowers the threshold so that others might take an action that they wouldn't have in perhaps that riot. Well, that brings us back to the second point, and that is Columbine really set the script. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold set the cultural script. They had a website, they had movies, they spelled out their motivations. They made it easier for others to follow him. And one study that looked at school shooters 8 years after, in the 8 years after Columbine, found that most of them made specific references to Harris and Klebold, and even a majority of school shootings outside of the United States were versions of Columbine. Now, that's just true for the school shootings, but I think it applies in a more general way to the mass shootings. So when we see these coming in like twos and threes, it helps us understand that. And, of course, one of the things I've tried to do over the years is not even say the names of these individuals. I'm not going to give them any publicity. They don't deserve any publicity. If anything, as Kelly Shackelford and I have said many times before, they deserve shame. We need to make fun of them. We may need to help others that might even consider this recognize that they will not get any attention. They will be considered to be worthless and to be shamed and to be, if anything, criticized. And that might change some things, but who am I to say? But those are some ideas that we might think about. If nothing else, if you've been out on Facebook, and I don't recommend it, by the way, but if you've been out on Facebook, you know that everybody has a solution, and I don't think the answer is one solution. I don't think this is a one-size-fits-all answer. But if you got something to write with, you might number 1 to 7 and follow me on this, because this comes from a very good piece by Jim Garrity, who I quote quite often. I mean, again, we just appreciate some of the writings that he has done for National Review. He entitles this Shoehorning Multiple Causation Shootings into a Single Cause Narrative. And it's one that I came off about and found later, but I might turn it into a commentary or might even post this later in the week if this turns out to be helpful for some people. But he makes a case that, you can't find a single cause. And frankly, if you go out on the internet right now and say, this is due to video games, people are going to just come after you saying, or it's due to fatherlessness or whatever. But I think if you look at each one of these cases and then put them all together, there are some common patterns. There's, again, no one size fits all, but there are some common patterns. Number one, he says, often, but not always, there's no father in the home. And I thought it was kind of interesting because one of these articles that came out, this is about a year ago, Of the 27 deadliest mass shooters, 26 of them had one thing in common. What's that? Fatherlessness. Matter of fact, one individual said, deeper even than the gun problem is this: boys are broken. And so when you look at this particular study, and again, it's a year old, so it doesn't include the ones we've just been talking about here, but a year ago, of CNN's list of 27 deadliest mass shootings in U.S. history, only one of those shooters was raised by his biological father since childhood. Now, does that explain everything? No, but it's one of 7 things we might look at, and that is, first of all, no father in the home. Number 2, often but not always, the shooter has no friends or few friends and nothing resembling a real support network. And so, again, we recognize that they tended, in some cases, to be loners. Does that explain all of them? No, but often it does explain or is one of the characteristics. Number 3, often, but not always, the shooter is unemployed or barely employed. Of course, we've seen that in a number of situations. Number 4, often, but not always, the shooter had some mental health issue, sometimes formally diagnosed, sometimes not. And of course, we've talked about some of the issues of mental health, also even some of the psychotropic drugs that some might have been on. And so that is certainly a possibility. Number 5, often, but not always, the shooter played violent video games. I just mentioned the shooter for Sandy Hook, the number of kills that he had on his video games, the number of headshots he had in his video games. We've had David Grossman on this program to talk about that some of these video games are almost like killing simulators. Does that explain all of them? No. Does that mean that all violent individuals are on video games? No. Does it mean that all kids that are on video games are going to be violent? No. But often, not always, we see that to be the case. That's number 5. Number 6, often, but not always, the shooter was active on extremist or Columbine-focused chat boards or had a noticeable interest in or obsession with previous mass shootings. Just gave you that example a minute ago from the since the Columbine shooters, and even, of course, the one in Sandy Hook. And then number 7, often, but not always, the shooter has gotten in trouble in school or has been kicked out of school. And so you can look at those 7 examples, and then Jim Garrity goes on and says, and then in every single case, when the shooter leaves some sort of message, it reveals that he has convinced himself that he is the real victim of powerful forces beyond his control, and that the only remaining option he sees for defiance is shooting as many random people as possible in a public place. And in every single case, the shooter manages to get his hands on a gun, sometimes legally purchasing them, sometimes stealing them or taking them from someone else. And of course, a lot of people have focused on the guns himself. Nick Pitts will be in this chair tomorrow, and in his daily briefing, he said this individual in Dayton killed 9 people in less than a minute. Is this a gun problem or a cultural problem? An American is approximately 300 times more likely to die in a gun homicide or accident than a Japanese person. So you have some of those kinds of examples there as well. Also, when we begin to read some of the things that these individuals actually say, they come from, for example, one of those websites is the 8chan website, and it turns out that that is now going to be shut down. The El Paso shooter, who was wrote that manifesto, actually posted it on the 8chan website, and he expressed sympathy for the racial motivations of that individual in New Zealand who was shooting individuals. He also denounced Hispanic immigration, but also raged against unchecked corporations who support immigration and pollute the land. And I think it's kind of interesting. After the break, I'm going to point out that oftentimes, even when an individual probably doesn't even know who the president of the United States is, like the shooter in New Zealand, nevertheless, critics have blamed Donald Trump even for the shooting in New Zealand. In this case, some of the things he said does seem to parallel with Donald Trump. But then when we come to the individual in Dayton, if anything, he's about as anti-Trumper as he can be. So, of course, some of that doesn't get covered in the news because it doesn't fit the meme. And this is why it's important to recognize that in some cases there are some very important needs for us to have a level of discernment. But let me come back and share a little bit about what we do know from the writings of these two shooters. And that also illustrates again that you better not just try to find one single answer. Life is a lot more complex than that. We'll talk about this right after these important messages.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And once again, oftentimes, of course, as the fact that we are in a political season, there are going to be a lot of finger-pointing, especially at the president. The president has given some individuals an opportunity to do so. But let's, for a minute, just say, okay, how connected are either of these shooters to the president or a variety of others? Of course, those of us in Texas have even heard people connecting the shooter in El Paso to the lieutenant governor. So after a while, it gets a little bit unhinged, I would have to say. But nevertheless, let's at least acknowledge that the El Paso shooter writing a manifesto on 8chan, which, by the way, is now being closed down. So that, I think, is a positive. Let's not provide an opportunity for white supremacists or other individuals to communicate back and forth. But certainly he did denounce Hispanic immigration, used the word invasion, which the president has used before. But let's be fair also, if you read his manifesto, and I'm only looking at what other people have said, he also talks about unchecked corporations and makes some statements that sound a little bit like some of the things we heard in the Democrat debate last night. When you come to the individual in Dayton, you probably will not have heard this because it doesn't fit the theme that this is all due to Donald Trump, because the shooter social media describes himself as a metalhead, a leftist. He says, "I'm going to hell and I'm not coming back." He wrote on Twitter that he would happily vote for a Democrat, Elizabeth Warren. He, on one Twitter account, praised Satan, was upset about the 2016 presidential election, so he did not like the fact that Donald Trump was elected. On another tweet, he says, "I want socialism, and I'll not wait for the idiots to finally come around to understanding." So, again, I think you have to understand that it's not a one-size-fits-all, because only a handful of those who play violent video games are mass shooters. There are lots of people that grow up in homes without a father, who are loners or underemployed, even have mental health issues that are not in the news. These are two examples that I think illustrate this. But at the same time, the Wall Street Journal pointed out that some of the things that Donald Trump has said, they say his divisive tone of his public rhetoric has not been helpful. He should separate himself forcefully and consistently from the alt-right and white supremacist voices and things like that. And then go on, I thought it was kind of interesting to say his supporters may be correct that Mr. Trump's opponents will not reciprocate by pushing back against the irrational elements of the left, but then they argue, well, a president should do that anyway. And I think it's interesting because it suggests that white supremacist groups should be listed as domestic terrorist groups. Nobody has a problem. Suggests that Antifa be listed as a domestic terrorist group. Well, then you got a problem with that. And so there are a lot of people that are just speaking to these issues from their tribes, and I hope we can come together and have some kind of conversation. And as they end, they talk about one of the common elements from the shooter in Parkland or the shooter in Oregon's Umpqua Community College or the shooter in Newtown, Connecticut, or the shooter in Sutherland Springs, Texas, or whatever, is that they were deeply troubled and alienated from society in an increasingly atomistic culture. And if that's true, and I think that it is, then it points out something we've talked about on this program before. Peter Berger used to talk about the so-called mediating institutions that would help individuals form cultural and social attachments. Those would be churches and businesses and social clubs like Rotary and charity groups and even bowling leagues and, most importantly, the family. And so we can see some of those issues as very important as well. Each day this week, if I have time, I want to try to take on one of the wrong or incorrect or false or fake news statistics. And one of those is we keep hearing that America leads the world in mass shootings. And that has been debunked by the Crime Prevention Research Center. But probably the better way to illustrate this is with a graph, and I'll just show that for those of you watching online, but it's also on my Facebook. If you look at the graph that is most often posted on Facebook, which comes, by the way, from our friends at the New York Times, it says, "What explains U.S. mass shootings? International comparisons." And you see this great outlier here, the United States. Well, that's based upon the number of shootings. But if you correct the data and compare the number of shooters per capita to the gun ownership rate across countries, then the United States has certainly a lot more guns than anybody else. But in terms of the shooting per capita, then it's really no different than countries like Finland or all sorts of other European countries that are hovering right there. So the point I'm making is there are hundreds of millions of people in the United States. And so if you compare Sweden or Finland or Switzerland, which, by the way, has quite a number of guns, to the United States, of course, the numbers are going to be bigger. But if you compare the numbers per capita, that's different. Then this is something that's not in the chart, but I've seen this done before. If you then take out, for example, let's just pick Chicago for a minute. 274 people have been killed in Chicago, said no one in the mainstream media. That's right. In Chicago this year, already 274 people have been killed. That's a little bit more than the 30 we've talked about over the weekend. 1,355 have been shot and wounded. And so as a result, you are talking about the total number of shot of 1,629 individuals. That doesn't get covered very often. And so you recognize that there are some very violent places in America. You take those few places out, and you don't end up with the kinds of problems that oftentimes make the mainstream media. But as we conclude, let me just say, are there solutions to this? And I think it comes back to some of these biblical solutions. And Michael Ferris did a good job of saying that, really there is a very important factor that's apparent. He says these killers did not hold life to be sacred. He said we need to ask ourselves, does society hold life sacred? Do we individually hold life to be sacred? He says the fact that 4,000 babies die in Planned Parenthood offices and other clinics every day is the most glaring fact that such an analysis, the advent of euthanasia, demeans the sacred character of life, and our entertainment involves an awful lot of killing. Those who get behind a steering wheel impaired by alcohol or drugs do not hold life sacred, and there are countless other reckless actions that send a message that I don't think your life and safety require me to be careful. But there's another level of analysis. For life to be sacred, we have to view human life as unique. The word sacred literally requires the imprint of God. Life is an inalienable God-given right. The Declaration of Independence says inalienable is a legal term, meaning that no one can take it from me, nor can I voluntarily surrender it. The Judeo-Christian heritage, he says, views life in this manner. A few other religions and philosophies hold roughly similar views, but atheism struggles to find a philosophical path that leads to the sacredness of life. This is principally because of the connection of evolution to atheism. If humans are random cosmic accidents, then they're no different than other life forms. Pride, selfishness, arrogance, many other factors embellish the propensity to violence that arises when life is cheap. There are many other factors we can and should consider. We need a thoughtful national conversation about causes. But I fear all this is likely to happen, that politicians will yell at each other about guns. Such opportunistic divisiveness is far closer to the cause than it is the cure. Life is in fact sacred because we're created in the image of God. Those of us who believe this need to join hands to figure this out. And we will never solve it entirely, but we can and must make this a whole lot better. Great comments from Michael Ferris, so just wanted to thank you for listening today. Let me just mention this week we're going to have Michael Yosef with us, Brad Dacus, Samuel Rodriguez. It's going to be a great week of programs. Looking forward to it. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for the help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful mission. I believe in America. I believe God wants His best for us. We can face whatever the world throws at us as long as we stand together. If you have not signed on, please do it now. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Set up your monthly gift by clicking the Truth Team 360 picture and then carefully follow the directions. Pointofview.net. By phone, you can give at 1-800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Or call us 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.